Mesdames et messieurs, Angela Davis.
So I can see you? I just arrived about an hour ago. I just went through Canadian customs an hour ago. And it was the first time that I went through so quickly. Well, let me thank the Fro Foundation for having invited me to participate in your celebration of Black History Month. And I am totally impressed by the work that the foundation has done and continues to do, especially with respect to artists and cultural workers. We need the creativity, we need the visions, we need the imagination of artists and poets who teach us to dream and to struggle for the realization of our dreams. So thank you very much, Fro Foundation. You know that the theme of your celebration this month is the struggle is not over. The fight is not over. Am I right? Yeah. And so I decided that I would take a theme from Dr. Martin Luther King, who said once, "Justice is indivisible. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." As I was leaving the U.S. this morning, I actually flew from Los Angeles to Atlanta and Atlanta to Montreal. I read that Forrest Whitaker, you know Forrest Whitaker? I read that he had been in New York, I guess it was yesterday, and stopped to buy something at a delicatessen, a deli. One of the employees looked at him and decided that he looked like somebody who was in the store to steal something, and insisted that Forrest Whitaker allow them to frisk him. And so he was frisked. Of course, he hadn't stolen anything. And perhaps some of you know about the police stop and frisk laws in New York. But it seems to me, you know, of course everyone is upset that Forrest Whitaker was treated like a common criminal. But they don't think about the fact that this is a daily experience for vast numbers of Black people and people of color in New York, all over the country, and here in Canada as well. The presumption of criminality. The presumption of criminality has persisted since the days of slavery. Now, I want to just say something that is perhaps a little bit more uplifting. And that is that the last election in the U.S., Barack Obama was elected the second time. I remember the first time he was elected, and I actually visited Canada immediately after the election, and people were even more excited in Canada than they were in the US. I saw hotels with big, big images of him, but this last election was even more important. Not so much because of anything the individual Barack Obama has or has not done, but because of what it taught us about the changes that have occurred and are occurring in our part of the world. Now, one of the things that was really troubling was that the majority of white men voted for Romney. The majority of white men. And that tells us something about the persistence of racism. However, 96% of black women voted for Barack Obama. 96%. Something like 87% of Latina women and the majority of white women voted for Obama. Now, it used to be the case that affluent, white, straight, hearing men control the destiny of the US and to a large extent of Canada as well. The recent election demonstrated that white men do not control the scene any longer. And when I say, you know what I'm talking about when I say white men, right? I'm not talking about all white men. I'm talking about the 1%. Unless you remember the 1%. I'm talking about the forces of racism. And Black history, which is the theme of this, I forgot to look at my watch to see what time I started speaking because because I know we're supposed to have a conversation afterwards. But the point that I want to make about Black History Month is that it is the history of the quest for liberation. And it belongs to all people who identify with and cherish historical and ongoing struggles for freedom. Black history, whether here in North America or in Africa or in Europe, has always been infused with a spirit of resistance. And when we celebrate Black history, it's not primarily for the purpose of representing Black people in the numerous roles as first to break the barriers of racism, although that's very important as well. Although there are a lot of firsts I don't celebrate. I'm thinking about someone like Condoleezza Rice. Remember when she became the first Black woman Secretary of State? That was not a victory. And I think we should periodically reflect on how we think about issues of race. And it's not all straightforward. Just as I was saying, when I say white men, I'm not talking about all white men. I'm not talking about working class white men who have been associated with the struggle against racism. I'm not talking about people like John Brown historically, for example. They don't fit into that shorthand that we use. But let me say that even though it may be important to acknowledge these, first, we celebrate Black history because it is a centuries-old struggle for freedom, a centuries-old struggle to expand the parameters of freedom for everyone, for everyone. Now, some of you may have seen the film Lincoln, right? No? Yes. Okay. And you probably also know that this is the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And it's so bizarre. I would have thought that had slavery really been abolished, we would be celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Nobody has celebrated. I mean, a few things here and there, but there have not been any calls for any massive celebrations of what is often represented as a major step toward Black freedom. Maybe it wasn't such a major step towards Black freedom. Maybe that is why it's not being celebrated. As a matter of fact, if we look carefully at that document, we see that it was a military strategy. It wasn't really about liberating people of African descent from an oppressive system of slavery. It was about saving the Union. And if you read the document itself, you'll see that most of the words in that document are devoted to a description of the exceptions, that is to say, which parts of the country got to keep their slaves. And it's quite bizarre because the Union, states that remain within the Union, and even neighborhoods that remain loyal to the Union got to keep their slaves. So if you look at the document that Lincoln issued, you see that it is about creating a situation that would produce a military crisis. And that is to say, and in a sense you can say Lincoln was very shrewd, because even though he wasn't at that time that concerned about freeing Black people, he was concerned about keeping the Union and retaining the strength of the Union. So he knew that if he issued this Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, that vast numbers of Black people would, as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, withdraw their labor from the planters and the other members of the slaveholding class, and they would give that labor to the Union Army. And he knew that Black people would fight far more passionately than any of the white soldiers to save the Union, because it meant the possibility of freedom. So in a sense, Lincoln was really shrewd. And it was a powerful military strategy that won. And as a matter of fact, W.E.B. Du Bois, in his amazing description of the end of the Civil War and the period of radical Reconstruction that followed it, argues that it was Black soldiers that won the Civil War. Black soldiers won the Civil War. Now, the film addresses the 13th Amendment. And the backstory of that film is that it took Lincoln a while to become convinced that it was important to not only abolish slavery, but to envision a society, to envision a future in which black people would still be present. At the time he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he assumed that the vast majority of free black people were going to be transported to an area of Africa. He was for colonization. But by the time that he argued for the 13th Amendment, he had been persuaded that black people would be members of a future U.S. society. But some of you have probably read the 13th Amendment, huh? I mean, I know that you're not expected to know U.S. history. This is not the U.S. This is Canada. But I've always been amazed that people can assume that a few lines constituting an amendment to the Constitution could eradicate a system of slavery that had such a long history, that was so much a part of the fabric of U.S. society, the culture of U.S. society, the economy. A few, maybe 20 words, you append those to the Constitution and slavery's over. That makes no sense. Well, the amendment actually does contain an exception as well, and that exception is people who are convicted of committing crimes. So the Constitution allowed for slavery to continue as long as people who were treated as slaves were convicted criminals. So we have this legacy of slavery in the U.S. prison population today. And what's really interesting is that, as Michelle Alexander in her recent book, The New Jim Crow, pointed out, there are more black men in prison and under the direct control of criminal justice systems in the U.S. than there were enslaved in 1850. So that tells us something about the persistence of slavery, that tells us something about the fact that, as Faulkner once wrote, the past is not dead. It is not even past. And in so many ways, we are haunted by the ghost of slavery. And as a matter of fact, the movement during the 60s, during the 50s and 60s that we know as the Civil Rights Movement in the U.S. was in many ways the continuation of the movement to abolish slavery. It was a 20th century anti-slavery movement. Because otherwise, how can you explain that in the 1950s and the 1960s, when I was growing up in the most segregated city in the South, black people were not only considered inferior, but were not allowed to have access to any of the services that a democracy is supposed to provide. I went to segregated schools. I drank segregated water growing up. As a matter of fact, a young friend of mine, we were kids, came down from New York to visit, and she just did not understand colored water. She thought maybe the water was colored. You know, maybe it was a different color. But yeah, it would not have been necessary to organize that movement had slavery been fully abolished. What happened in the aftermath of this so-called abolition of slavery was the creation of Jim Crow rules and regulations. As a matter of fact, there was a brief period that nobody ever talks about. And that was the period from the end of the Civil War until 1877. That was the period that Du Bois calls radical Reconstruction. Nobody wants to hear about that period, because that is a period in which there were amazing laws passed. As a matter of fact, not only laws that benefited black people, but laws that benefited poor white people as well. There were, this is when black people were elected to state legislatures. Black people fought for the right to be educated. That was one of the major struggles. And in the 21st century, education has deteriorated to the extent that you could perhaps say that it is even worse than it was in the mid-20th century. But black people fought for the right to education, fought for public education. And public education was established in the South, which gave white children the opportunity to get an education as well. These poor white kids had never been able to enjoy access to education. During that period of radical Reconstruction, very progressive divorce laws were passed, laws that allowed women to assert some power. This is the period that no one ever wants to talk about. It was a period that during which people had, you know, you might say even a glimpse of socialism back then. But with the overturning of radical Reconstruction, we had the creation of Jim Crow laws, the worst kind of racism imaginable. Well, perhaps I shouldn't say the worst kind of racism imaginable, because this is how we think about racism in the 21st century. We think about that period when everything was segregated, when black people didn't have access to education. And now we assume that because there are black people who are in important positions, some black people have been educated, right? We even have black people who are in the hierarchies of major corporations, right? We even have a black person who is president, right? But what has fundamentally changed? Immediately after the election, many prisoners said there may be one black man in the White House, but there are 1 million black men in the big house. And so it's important to consider structural racism. Racism that asserts itself often silently through the structures of the major institution of society. So when you say the fight is not over, we're also saying that this will perhaps be one of the most difficult fights. Because we're challenging a racism that many people don't even acknowledge as being racism. And racism racism makes a difference when it comes to who gets to go to the university and who gets to go to prison. It makes a difference when it comes to who feels safe when they see a policeman or a policewoman, and who fears the presence of the police in hyper saturated communities that are the communities that produce the unfortunate people who end up spending much of their lives in prison. But as we think about the indivisibility of justice, we have to say that it is not simply an issue of racism isolated from heteropatriarchy, or racism isolated from struggles to save the environment, or racism isolated from homophobia, or racism isolated from food politics. The challenge of this era is grasping all of the connections, grasping the indivisibility of justice, recognizing, and I should say that I was actually very impressed by Obama's inauguration speech, when he referred to Seneca Falls, Selma, and Stonewall. And what he was suggesting was that there is a connection between the struggle for women's rights, the struggle against racism, and the ongoing struggle against homophobia. I like to take a feminist position with respect to Obama, because there are a lot of things I don't like about Obama. There are a lot of criticisms I have, but at the same time, I think his election has made a difference. So I want to both be able to be fiercely critical of him, and I also want to fiercely support him. And that fierce support is not so much the support for an individual, but rather it is the support for vast numbers of people, largely young people, who were, in the first place, refused to believe that it was impossible to elect a black man to the presidency of the United States of America, when everybody else said it is impossible.